in the last few days. But it's so great to see all of you, and thank you so much for supporting the museum. I'm really thrilled that actually we're joined by Tarak today, because Tarak has written one of the most amazing and impactful books on the Indian Army and Empire Soldiers at War of recent times, I think. And I very much encourage you to buy it. Tarak is a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's a historian of war and empire with an interest in reimagining relations between war, the armed forces, and society in modern times. And if you are interested in buying his book, Soldiers of Empire, you will see there is a link in the call to action there. If you follow that, you will be able to buy his book from the museum's online bookshop. And not only will you get a fantastic read out of it, you'll also be able to support the work of the museum as well. So no pressure, but please do click through and do that. Tarak, thank you so much for joining us today. This is going to be really exciting. I'm really pleased you can talk about this topic. I think I'll just dive right in, Tarak, and actually just ask you, what is it about this topic that first drew you in and made you want to sort of dive in and research it in such detail?
Well, when military sociology really got going in the Second World War, and the study of armies in a serious military historical and military sociological way took off, the armies that they studied were national armies. And I think our sort of understanding about why it is that soldiers fight, how soldiers are formed, it was really shaped by the fact that we were only studying the British Army, the German Army, and especially the American Army, because the Pentagon sponsors a lot of military sociology. And I think over time, this kind of focus on Western national armies has kind of warped our understanding of soldiers. And I was conscious with a sort of wider historical lens that for most of world history, armies have been imperial in one sense or another. They've been composed of multiple ethnicities. They're not particularly fighting for their homelands or for the political purposes of the war. So are these armies entirely different than Western national armies? Or might there be hidden similarities that we could find if we looked more closely at the way that imperial armies were organized? And so that was the initial sort of idea. And I began scanning about for armies that I could use for a study like this. Originally, I wanted to look at the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and compare it to the Indian Army. But I was talked out of that by my PhD supervisor. And when I discovered the Indian Army, I really, wow, this is the army to explore this in. Instead of using the Wehrmacht as the symbol of why soldiers fight and how we think of armies, let's use the British Indian Army and see what we might find that's different from the story that we tell with national armies. That's really the origin of where the book came from.
I'm definitely going to ask you about comparing the Indian and the British armies in the same book a bit later on. But on that subject, obviously as historians, we love to explore the unknown. We love to tell these new histories of things, and yet so often we are governed by the sources that are available. And if you don't have the sources, then you can't tell the story. Where did you find the sources for you to do this? Where did your research take you? Did you find things that were complete and able to unpack all this stuff and yet had never been used before?
Well, the Indian Army really puts the historian in a good position. The British authorities were so concerned about dissension, morale problems, and mutiny in the Indian Army that they surveilled it very closely. And they produced a great archival record. For example, during the Second World War, censors read the mail of Indian soldiers, and they produced elaborate censorship reports, complete with extended and translated excerpts from the letters. And they would do this on a regular basis throughout the war. So it's a marvelous resource. I'm not a South Asianist. I'm embarrassed to say that I did this research almost entirely. I did go to India, but I did this research almost entirely from London archives. Another source that I found particularly useful is immediately after the war, when the surviving wartime officers were still present. Many of the battalions produced Typescript battalion histories. And these were, very raw accounts. They were not like a regimental history written long after the fact, intended to carry on the name of the regiment. They were written by the people who'd fought the war. And they were very honest about the problems they'd encountered and very praiseworthy about soldiers and officers who'd helped them overcome those problems. Those sources I found invaluable. Another significant source for me was I was one of the last scholars to go around and interview company officers, British officers, some Indian officers who served, some Indian or South Asian officers who served in World War II in company grade positions. I did about 30 of those interviews in the late 90s and the very early part of this century. And that was, mind-boggling to go and talk to people who'd actually raised and fought with this army. And again, tell you various stories about that if you want to go on with that. But I would say that those are the sort of lists of sources that were significant. And another place the Indian Army is very good is that the South Asian officers who served in the Indian Army in World War II went on to be prominent officers in the armies of Pakistan, India, and later, of course, Bangladesh. And those officers were fluent in English, and many of them wrote memoirs, elaborate memoirs of their experience. They have to be handled carefully, like all memoirs, but there are quite a few of them. And so that was able to give me an insight on South Asian officers fighting for their colonizer in the Second World War. So you're sort of in a situation of archival plenty for the Indian Army, and I encourage young scholars, to take that seriously.
Fantastic. I mean, I think obviously we tend to associate, the Indian Army as the largest volunteer army ever raised. But in the initial years of the Second World War in the Far East, and obviously there are Indian Army units who are moved to fight in North Africa and places like that relatively quickly. This is a very different army. Could we perhaps talk a little bit about who was in that army? Could you explain maybe martial race theory, that sort of thing? The idea about in the early years about British attitudes to recruitment from the Indian subcontinent.
There's a lot there, so I'll say some, and you can press me for more. Often scholars of the Indian Army in World War II talk about sort of two different armies. The first army is the old regular Indian Army, composed of long service, volunteer, professional soldiers. This was why the Indian Army was so attractive to graduates from Sandhurst. You were with professional soldiers, a long service army. They composed the units that were sent off to Africa, North Africa, the Middle East early in the war. That left war-raised battalions, many of them very untrained or very poorly trained, no jungle training, for the initial opening of the war in the Pacific for Britain, in Malaya and in Burma, where the Indian Army performed very poorly, and so too did the British generals, or many of them. It's interwoven. It's not all the fault of the Indian soldier. And so when the Indian Army goes to recruit for the later part of the war, they are bringing in peasants, many of them not of the mainline martial races from communities that the army had been recruiting at for a long time. These were still volunteers, but this is in a situation of nascent famine, of wartime controls on grain prices, and a situation where many soldiers joined the army for economic reasons, and later in the height of the famine in 43, 44, they joined for food. So it's volunteer, but with a heavy push economically. And those soldiers did not have a tradition of service in the army or relatives who had been in the army for generations and generations. Now, the army tried very hard to keep its infantry and combat formations only from the communities that it had been recruiting from. So the martial races were more in evidence in the combat formations than they were in the support troops. But these two different categories of soldier are very sociologically different in the Indian Army. The old regulars were very against the independence movement. They understood that the British were dependent upon them for their rule in India. They very much wanted the British to stay. The new classes of soldier and officer in the army were not so attached to the Raj, but they were attached to the economics of the army. And one of the very interesting facts about 1945 is that while British soldiers were desperate to demobilize and get home, Indian soldiers, by and large, wanted to stay in the army. They'd never had it so good in terms of food and pay.
That political dynamism is fascinating, because obviously there's a similar reflection in the UK, I think, as well. If you look at the conscripts versus the pre-war regulars and the different political opinions there. You mentioned the census reports earlier. I mean, do those differences between those pre-war regulars, I'm thinking the Punjabis or the Sikhs or something like that, do the census reports demonstrate a real difference in how these different groups perceive the war, what they're fighting for, whether it's what's good and what's bad about it, and perhaps also even the Japanese? I mean, perhaps we can sort of lead on to that as well.
A little bit. Because the Indian Army is organized in terms of these martial classes, as they're called by World War II, all the reports will often refer to the class of soldier who is writing the letter. But in another sense, the bulk of the Indian Army and the bulk of the fighting army are Punjabi and North Indian peasants. Right, they are not super poor peasants, but not by any means. This is more, as it were, a middle peasant, families who had some wherewithal, and I think that sort of the situation of the village in the midst of wartime economic disruption and famine became absolutely vital for Indian Army morale. And so what happened is that the British took extra steps to make sure that Indian soldiers heard good news about what was happening in the villages, that their money got home to their villages, and that the famine was prevented from raging too heavily in areas that the Indian Army recruited from. So that village situation on the home front became very significant in the middle part of the war for the morale of the Indian Army. That was more important than whether you were a Sikh, a Muslim, or whatever particular class, although there are, of course, particular problems that related to the particular class or community that people came from. I think is more significant than the sort of ethno-religious identity of the soldiers, at least in terms of morale. As you know from the book, one of the things that I demonstrate in the book is that in the middle of World War II, this business of keeping class company battalions, where a battalion would have a company of Punjabi Muslims, a company of Sikhs, a company of Dogras, a company of Pathans, it was impossible to maintain that structure at the fighting front. And battalion officers would often have to mix classes together, and even Hindu and Muslim classes together in the same company. And whether these arrangements worked depended much more on sensible and fair officering than it did on the particular identity or prejudice of the troops concerned.
I mean, that officer's point, I think, is really interesting. And one of the things I was struck by the book, and perhaps you could tell the viewers a little bit more about, is I think when we tend to think about the Indian Army in the Second World War, we think about officers who come in and perhaps they're pre-war regulars and they have this great affinity with the men. They speak the language and can fluently chat. But I mean, your research found that wasn't the case. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, some pre-war regulars paid very close attention to language and culture, and they really learned about their soldiers in that kind of ethnographic sense. But that was not the norm. And if you go and look in the Indian United Services Journal, which is the Army's journal before the war, you'll find regular officers regularly bemoaning the standard of language instruction, even among the pre-war regular officers. Now, if their standard, Slim was one of the characters who was very concerned about this. Because, of course, he spent a lot of time learning Gurkhali and being able to speak the language of his men, although even he had problems understanding, especially early in his career. Now, if regular officers have this problem, if people who have made their careers in India have this problem, the wartime emergency commissioned officers, British emergency commissioned officers, were hardly going to become experts in Urdu, in the particular language of the class of their men as well, the vernacular, in the time that they had to train. So the Indian Army went to war as a Tower of Babel. There was the vernacular of each company. There was Urdu, which is the language of command in the army as the whole, and there's the English that the English officers speak. And I think one of the challenges that the Indian Army presents to military sociology is how does an army where the officers and men don't understand each other able to fight effectively in modern war? It turned out they were able to. That really puts a kind of hole in the idea that a common national culture is required for an army to fight a war effectively.
I mean, that United Nations piece, seeing the Indian Army as an army of the United Nations, I think is so significant. I think, is it 40 different languages, I think, that's spoken in the Indian Army in 14th Army at least. Yeah. And I mean, you compare that to the British Army, I think, really successfully. I mean, and why do that and approach that sort of from a comparative viewpoint?
Well, as I said in the beginning, that this in many ways this was the origin of my question. Comparing this imperial army, which I wanted to see more as the norm than a national army. And one of the ways in which, of course, we think of the Indian Army as very different is exactly in these terms of caste and martial races. And so what I do at the very end of the book is I come back to a battalion of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers that I researched very heavily, that fought in Dombasle and throughout the war in Burma. And in the Arakan campaign, the first Royal Welsh had a very talented territorial army officer, A.H. Williams, who'd been wounded at Dunkirk and found himself in command of the 1st Battalion of this old line infantry regiment of the British Army, in which, even though it's called the Royal Welsh, the officers were English. Some of the troops are Welsh, but of course, as those of you who know the British Army well will know the Royal Welsh Fusiliers were often called the Birmingham Fusiliers because there were so many, English people from the Midlands who had holidayed on the mid-Welsh coast and had a connection to the regiment. And what I show is that what we call caste in India also operated in the British Army. The English regular officers were determined to get this guy, A.H. Williams, out of the command position of the 1st RWF, even though he was a very effective and beloved battalion commander. And so I show that caste, if we understand it properly in a sociological way, also operated in the British Army. I don't have the quote to hand, but one of my sort of favorite lines to this effect is a South Asian officer who is at Sandhurst in the 1920s. And he begins to try to figure out the relations of private schools or public schools, and families amongst his fellow British cadets. And he says, well, it's sort of a caste system, right? And goes on to describe this. And that's really why it is that I put these two together. The book is mostly about the Indian Army, but I come back to this comparative dimension at the very end of the book to show. Another, just to stick it in while I'm talking, another kind of comparison between the British and Indian soldier, which is worth thinking about. We often read, especially in the Pacific War and the Eastern Front, about the significance of ideology, nationalism, and racism in making the troops fight hard and commit what I call extracurricular violence, that's not associated with strictly military purposes. Well, both the Indian soldier and the British soldier had not really thought very much about Japan before the war. For both soldiers, it was actual experience of combat that led to the kind of racist and hateful attitudes towards the Japanese soldier, rather than any kind of pre-existing, cultural prejudice in society. The kinds of explanations that are used for why the German army does what it does on the Eastern Front. So in this sense, both the Indian soldier, this peasant who doesn't speak English, who's unaware of who the Japanese or the Germans are, particularly doesn't have a particular issue with them, and the British soldier are in a sort of similar position. And by the end of the war, if you were a combat soldier fighting the Japanese, you had a belly full of hate for them because of the way they fought and the things that they made you do on the field of battle.
Yeah, and I think that's a fascinating contrast to something like Bertov's book, War Without Mercy. the Eastern Front, which I think is really significant and interesting. That the attitude of the Japanese is something I wanted to pick up with, because obviously there are Indian soldiers who fight for the Japanese and the Indian National Army. And I was, can you know, how does the Indian National Army figure in your research?
Well, the Indian National Army is a very interesting thing, because one of the real differences between national soldiers in a war of nations and an imperial army is that when you're captured as a British soldier or a German soldier by the other side, you're unlikely, there are few, but you're unlikely to go over to the other side. They're unlikely to be able to raise troops from amongst captured prisoners. But imperial armies, going back to the Roman army and before that, that's a very normal thing. And in fact, the British did it in India when they conquered the Sikh kingdom. They promptly recruited the Sikhs into the army. This is a normal thing to do. People get to be soldiers again. They know how to fight. They know how to be soldiers. They're paid. They're officered fairly and competently, and they go back to being soldiers. So I think much of the way of thinking about the INA begins with that kind of insight, that in the larger canvas of world history, it's not that uncommon. For me, it's never a problem to explain the INA. If you can choose between being a prisoner of war in a Japanese prisoner of war camp and being worked to death, starved to death, or bayoneted by some angry prison guard and not guaranteed the Geneva Convention, or you could join the INA and have your old officers, and you can have this ideological veneer that we're fighting for our nation, whatever, you know, I think the choice makes itself for you. It's not that complicated. Prisoners of war from the national armies didn't really have that option. I think that's where I would begin to explain the INA. Another feature of the INA that is really important to get a hold of is that what happens in World War II is that the British have to expand their use of South Asian officers. Now, South Asian officers were literate, educated people aware of the politics of their time. They were almost to a man nationalists in that they wanted a higher status for India. That didn't mean they wanted to join Japan or Germany, but it meant that they wanted out of the British Empire. They wanted some kind of independent or at least dominion status. And so these officers were not loyal in the normal political sense that we might take an officer who swears to serve in his nation's army. And I think they provided a kind of very significant level of leadership for the INA and made it function. And something about these guys is worth keeping in mind as well. Many of them had initially liked the Japanese. The promise that the Japanese made was to get rid of the white empires. And they'd all seen the British first flub the Malaya campaign and then leave them behind in Japanese prison camps. And so they were attracted to the Japanese, but then they saw how the Japanese treated prisoners. They saw the Japanese unleash their very harsh rule on the civilian populations of Singapore and Malaya. They saw them force Indian soldiers to bayonet their former officers and so on. And they became aware that joining the INA was one of the ways to protect their own soldiers from the Japanese. And they were one of the ways to prevent the Japanese from pillaging and raping Indian civilian populations if the Japanese were ever to win the war. So in a sense, some of those officers had very complex motivations for what they did. And many of them tried to stay loyal for a long time, but before joining the INA. So it's a very interesting place to study. I think the archival story of the INA, there's really a lot more to do on this than has been done. It was just one of the things that I did in my book, but I think this is something that I would also encourage young scholars to look at more deeply. There are extensive collections of audio recordings of INA soldiers in the Singapore archives that someone needs to go and look at.
I mean, yes, and to be honest, if you're also looking at Japanese propaganda directed at Indians to try and encourage them to sort of throw off the yoke of British rule, my colleague Jazdeep has just produced a fantastic little video on the NAM website looking at some of these things. So perhaps Isabel or Nicola could share the link for audience to look at after we've finished, of course, because we're going to keep talking. it's really interesting what you said about, this fear about Japanese captivity and what that would mean. I mean, how much is that being, but also then the sort of the double-edged sword of that, which is you tell people too much about it, then when they're presented with this opportunity, they might actually go over the other side to spare themselves from it. I mean, do the British know in great detail what is happening in some of these prisoner of war camps? And are they feeding that into the troops at the front to try and steal their resolve? Is that actually taking place?
The British are petrified about the INA. They're petrified. They're deeply scared about this. And for reasons that are not stupid. As one British official in Delhi remarked, we're essentially trying to run a war from an occupied country. They understand, especially in the middle of World War II, the Congress Party had made it clear that they would support the war only if Britain promised independence, which it didn't do. Britain then locked up the Congress Party, called them a totalitarian organization. And there was an outbreak of a Quit India campaign to get rid of the British out of India, all across India from 42, petering out in 44. So when the INA, when the British become aware of the INA forming in Singapore, and a smaller, Hitler was always also doing this with prisoners captured in North Africa, but on a much smaller scale, they became petrified. And so they pay very close attention to what's going on with the INA. INA people are parachuted into India. They come back into the Indian Army to seed the Indian Army with people who had been turned by the Japanese. Many of these guys told the Japanese, of course I'll work for you, let me go back to India. They do and promptly turn themselves in. But the British are in this situation of all colonizers. They don't necessarily know what's in the head of the people that they've colonized. And so they are scared. And again, this produces a lot of archival material. They ask a lot of South Asian officers whose loyalty they are assured of, or people they know, to report on this. And there's a great deal of stuff produced around this, particularly around in 1943. But the panic, as it were, is unnecessary. The largest recruitment to the INA took place from Singapore, where the Indian Army had surrendered en masse, where British officers had been separated from their Indian troops, and the Indian soldiers are looking at years of captivity in the Japanese. That's the only place you raise en masse Indian soldiers to join the INA. The largest single unit that goes over to the INA after that is a platoon in the Arakan campaign that I talk about, a platoon that was badly officered, badly shot up and not given replacements, and have more mundane explanations for why they might have done what they did. So the fear, as it were, was misplaced. The problem was mass surrender. And as long as you're not doing that, the Indian Army would stay loyal to the British. And
I mean, is there a fear amongst any of the morale reports or anything like that, or at any particular times? You mentioned sort of 1943 as being the peak about this. After that, and when the British are sort of, after Kohima and Imphal, when the British seemingly have the momentum, does that fear begin to ebb? But before that also, is there a fear that any of these particular groups that we've talked about are more susceptible? Or is there a risk of they fear something more susceptible to some of this propaganda? Do they ever think the Gurkhas are going to be susceptible to it versus the Bengalis, or the Pathans versus the Punjabis, or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, the characters you're looking for there are the Sikhs, some of whom their families suffered various kinds of pogroms, and in addition to the famine, also ethnic killings in the Punjab. And they wanted to be home to protect their families, and were very concerned about that. And there were a whole spate of mutinies, small mutinies in Sikh units early in the war. And these really scared the Brits a little bit. So they would pay very attention to this. And it's part of the kind of martial race prejudice about the Sikh, that he's a scheming, sort of clever fellow, this kind of thing. At the same time, other Sikhs who are fully aware of the dependence of the Sikh community on employment in the Indian Army go out of their way to demonstrate to the British that there will not be further problems, right? So that this mechanism of employment in the army, of the community being tied to the Raj over a long period of time, works to balance out sort of local eruptions of disaffection that in many cases had their sources their sources in soldiers' worries for what was happening to their families at home. I forgot the direct question you were after me.
It was about those different groups and what was happening to affect morale in these ways, and whether there was a risk that the Japanese spoke better to Bengalis.
As one British propaganda officer who's trying to get the Indian Army soldiers to hate the British, he says it's really kind of artificial trying to hate the Japanese. Sorry, it's really rather artificial trying to get the Indian soldier to hate the Japanese. We really can't find a way to do that. And they would come up with various stories about how the Japanese will make the Muslim soldiers eat pork and the Hindu soldiers eat cows. And I think the Japanese had a similar kind of problem on this side. I don't think that higher political loyalties are really the decisive thing for infantry soldiers. I think that's the kind of takeaway from the book, that conditions of service, whether their officers are using their lives carefully and responsibly, whether they're being fed, whether their army is winning, whether they have a chance of coming home at the end of this. These are the kinds of things that I think are more significant, than what is my particular politics about this war.
Yeah, and I think that universality of service, the shrinking of horizons, if you will, beyond that, I think is something that really comes out in the book, and I think actually is a comparative point from different armies in different ages, which is excellent. I wanted to go back because we talked a little bit about language, and then we've talked a little bit about these sort of political ideologies clashing. What was it then that turned these forces? Because the Indian Army was part of the defeats and retreats of 41 and 42. So what was it that, if it wasn't officers with good language skills or anything like that, what was it that turned this army into, amongst the most effective armies that the British Commonwealth has ever put into the field?
Yeah, the Indian Army is not an elite shock force, right? But it mostly fights competently in the Second World War. It's able to fight the Afrika Korps, it's able to fight in Monte Cassino, and it's able to fight the Japanese. So what's the difference between early in the war and later in the war? Normal military things is my short answer. So let me give you an example of problems. If you've created an army where each battalion has 5 different kinds of troops that speak 5 different languages, and all of a sudden, in an action one afternoon, half the Pathan company is wiped out. And how are you going to replace those soldiers? If you're in Burma in 1943, one of the things that would happen to battalions at the front is they would suddenly get a draft of 100 replacements of a class that had not served in the battalion, without junior officers who spoke the vernacular of those soldiers, without VCOs, these intermediate officers that we've not talked about, who are very significant for discipline. How are you going to integrate, in the midst of active operations, an untrained draft of replacements who you can't speak to properly? Obviously, what would happen in those situations is that once your trained manpower had gotten sick or been wounded or killed, the fighting value of those, the efficiency of those, combat efficiency of those battalions is going to sink, right? How do you fix that? Well, one way you fix that is by the kinds of expedients I was talking about earlier, that officers at the front just started trying to figure out ways to officer these guys properly. But once Slim gets in charge, once they understand that they're putting untrained troops, not properly NCO'd or officered into battalions, they start going back to basics. They create advanced infantry training. 2 training divisions are formed for soldiers to go through after their basic training to get trained up as a jungle fighter. They clamp down very hard on any racial prejudice that old line British colonial and regular officers were demonstrating towards South Asian officers. They work very hard to integrate South Asian officers into the regiments, into the battalions. Auchinleck is very big on this, we have to be aware that we have had race prejudice, he says to the Indian Army Officer Corps, and we cannot be doing that in the middle of a war. You need to, all of these kinds of things that are about melding together and properly training battalions before they end up fighting a very efficient and professional enemy, the Japanese or the Germans. That's why the war starts working. The Indian Army starts working better towards the end of the war.
And I mean, and if you were to say, sort of identify one sort of main reason for victory in where it comes in this, I mean, where would you sort of place that?
I think victory is a bigger topic, right? Like we'd have to get into the relative, economic and other kinds of things in the war. That's another story. But why? What's the one thing that makes armies fight? I think it's kind of two things. One is that armies throughout world history, we often think of the army as a modern institution, but what an army does really well is rote instruction. Anything an army has to do can be broken down into steps and taught as a drill. A drill is a remarkable thing. It's both practice, but it is also solidarity building. It's also about building cohesion in a sense that we're all in this together. You put together a drill and this kind of ritual effect of solidarity, you have a trained unit. You add to that casualties, right? This is where I think military sociology in Western nation states has gone so badly wrong. They think that casualties are a problem for cohesion and solidarity in military formations, right? That once the primary group loses too many members, the unit is going to run away. Once the cohesion breaks down, people disappear, and what breaks down cohesion is casualties. This is a common assumption that both Bartov and Schills and Janowitz share. And what I argue is that if you take a unit where people have been trained together, they understand themselves to be part of a collective, and you kill some of them, never has the sense of solidarity and cohesion been stronger than at that moment. Casualties are blood sacrifice, and blood sacrifice builds up both cohesion and the desire for revenge on those who have inflicted that sacrifice. And if you understand that to be going on the other side, in the enemy army as well, you have a self-generating mechanisms for armies to have a will to fight one another. Ideally speaking, until the last man dies on both sides. There are many reasons why we don't get to that point for every army. The Japanese come close. But those are the secrets to why it is that armies fight effectively, and why it is that the Indian Army, the British Army, and the German Army share very important things in common.
I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, and I apologise that for some reason the lights has gone off in my room. So that's not me switching off at all. I'm actually riveted by what you just said.
The audience probably knows that one thing that COVID has led to is all of us had to turn our houses and offices into videographer places. Movie studios.
I've absolutely no idea why the lights have just turned off. It's quite strange. I've got one final question before I throw them open to the floor, which and they're all racking up, and that's about the experiences of some of these soldiers. Who obviously emigrate to the UK after the war. There is this huge pattern of migration that we know about, and yet inevitably amongst that were veterans of this war and veterans who stood alongside the British Army and fought with them. What were some of the experiences of those veterans in the UK after 1945?
That's another fascinating story that I wish someone would take on as the sort of central object of their study. I talked to many, and I have some sense of. One thing to say about Indian veterans who settled in Britain after the war is they identified with the Raj. So they call themselves the All India United Servicemen's Organization. In other words, they on their stationery and in their kind of imagery, they had a map of the subcontinent that has the borders of the entire Raj. And of course, if you're an immigrant to Britain, your internal differences with one another are much smaller than your differences with the host community. So the organization that advocated for the memorial gates that was very big in sort of bringing to the attention of the British people the role of the Indian Army in the Second World War, whenever they would show up, whenever the veterans were alive, they would show up with a Sikh, a Hindu, and a Muslim soldier. Right, to make the point that we were, all India. One of the experiences they often had, though, is that their image of Britain was a Britain in the midst of a very serious war in which all races came together. You know, this idea that Britain was alone in England was alone in 1940 is just totally wrong in terms of the way that people would have thought about it at the time. It was the empire. The empire was with us. And Indian soldiers who and pilots and people who came through Britain during the Blitz experienced this kind of ecstasy of everybody all together. The race difference didn't matter. Well, after the war, that wasn't so much the case. And I'll leave you with the story of a very interesting pilot who flew in the Battle of Britain, who flew missions over France, and who later flew in Burma, Mohinder Singh Pudji. He was written up in Saga, an OAP magazine, you know, as someone who'd had this big wartime career. And he began getting hate mail from people who insisted that an Indian was lying. It couldn't possibly be the case that he'd flown in the Battle of Britain, that he'd, you know, had this a kind of, you know, what we would be familiar with now is sort of flat out racism against South Asians in Britain. And when I went to interview the man, he was very old by that point. He'd been a pilot before the war. What was so sad was how determined he was to prove to me that he really was who he said he was. He showed me his Indian Air Force, Royal Indian Air Force card. He showed me various wartime pictures. He wanted to make sure to establish to me that he was his bona fides. And I thought that was the saddest thing. I knew who he was because of the way I found him. But he was concerned that I might think he wasn't real because of this experience. So that's, I think, a kind of coda on that story.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the First World War centenary, for example, I think one of the big transformations of the First World War centenary, I know Santanu Das has talked about this, is this growing awareness of the role of the Empire and the Commonwealth in the First World War. And perhaps on the back of VJ75, we can talk about and drive more awareness and understanding about some of these things as well. Well, certainly, if you look elsewhere in our program here, if you look at, we've got a video tomorrow coming out for a conversation between Captain Sir Tom Moore and Joseph Hammond. And Joseph Hammond fought with the 82nd West African Division in Burma. He currently lives in Ghana. So that would be fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tarak. I mean, it's brilliant. There's some questions that are lined up that I'm going to go to now, if that's all right. Adrian, oh, hi. This is Adrian in Malaysia. Adrian, it's great to see you with us again. Thank you so much for continuing to check in. Adrian asks, and there's a risky loaded word in this, but he says, can we assume that had the initial Indian Army soldiers that were sent to British Malaya instead of North and East Africa, the outcome of the Battle of Malaya would have turned out much differently?
I think that would depend on having different generals, right? The Indian Army and the British Army had simply not learned to fight the Japanese at that point. You know, there are wonderful stories of officers going over to Malaya. One I like from John Randall, became a British brigadier, and has a wonderful book called Battle Tales from Burma. He's dead now. He says that they were pulling out old British Army manuals about fighting in Norway, and translated Finnish manuals about fighting in forests as they're on the way over to Malaya, you know, like trying to figure out. And he goes and he says to his commander, well, where are we going to train? And we can't train here. It's all jungle. Well, of course, they would have to fight in the jungle, you know. The British Army was road bound in Malaya. It just wasn't ready for what it ran into. And the Japanese were extremely effective at maneuvering through the jungle, getting behind the British units, setting up blocks, and then the British would have to fight through them to retreat. So the Japanese got the advantages of defense while being on the strategic offensive. So I don't think better troops was going to make the difference. There were some battalions, both Indian and British, who fought very well in Malaya and gave very good account of themselves. But it was the overall conduct of the campaign that I think was the problem. So that would be my answer to that.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. You know, it's not really until 1944, is it, that the British figure out a way of actually counteracting that sort of that block strategy, which is to go to box fighting and just effectively just invite the Japanese onto them.
Exactly.
Of course, the flip side as well, Adrian, is if you had taken those good divisions out of North Africa, would the campaigns in North Africa and Italy turned out very differently as well, which being much closer to home to Britain were perhaps the strategic priority before 1942 at least. Alex Knight has asked about the morale of the Indian troops who served in the Western Theatre and how that was affected by the outbreak of war with Japan. Was there a sense amongst those troops that they wished to return and fight the enemy, which posed much more of a threat to their homeland and families? You talked a little bit about the village. Was there, and I suppose particularly when you look at the invasion of India in 1944, was there a sense that at that point when Japan threatened the India as a nation, was there any agitation amongst any of these troops that they wanted to go back and take part in the fight then?
Yeah, it's, that's a question I feel I'm not really able to answer because I don't have the evidence for it. So I'm going to be an honest historian about that one. It's an obvious question. I thought about it and looked for information about that. I think the biggest thing to say is the Japanese were just too late. They were just too late. Had they come into India in 1943 or 1942, I think the story would have been very different. They would have found an India up in arms against the British. And at that point, the Japanese were very highly thought of by many politically aware Indians. I think later in the war, there was a general confidence that the Allies were going to win. Indian soldiers in the Western Front and the European and Mediterranean theaters saw the scale of the Allied mobilization. They understood themselves to be part of a winning and very powerful coalition. There is much more evidence of fear of famine in wartime India than there is of fear of Japanese invasion. Now, whether at the moment of the Imphal Kohima campaigns, there is a fear that runs through units that are stationed in North Africa and Italy. That would be a question that someone who's focused on the Indian units in those theaters might ask and look for. I didn't see a great deal of evidence of that, but that was not the central thing I was studying. I was focused on what was going on in the Pacific War.
Robert Hilburn was asked about efforts by the Japanese to create anti-British colonial feeling, which we've sort of touched on a little bit. But one thing I wanted to ask you is, do you think the Japanese fully understood the differences within the Indian army as it stands? We've spent a long time unpacking this. Did the Japanese actually understand that, or was a weakness of their propaganda that they assumed it was too monolithic?
Well, the Japanese didn't have to do anything to make Indians dislike British rule. So I think that's something we should all, sort of take seriously. India mobilized to help the British in World War I. They thought after that war they would get a higher political status. And when they didn't, that is when the modern mass anti-colonial movement really gets underway in India. They don't need the Japanese for those dynamics. They're much more concerned with their own colonial ruler. Many colonized people were very thrilled with the Japanese at the beginning of the Pacific War. That is because they had not experienced Japanese rule. If you were in Manchuria or China in the late 30s, you would have said it's not going to work out very well. And the Japanese threw away that goodwill that they had by the harshness of the rule. And of course, they were also losing the war and had to mobilize resources from conquered populations in very harsh ways. Now, within the Japanese structure, the people who were organizing Indian troops, and in particular, I'm referring to a very interesting character named Colonel Fujiwara, they had a deep understanding of the way the Indian Army was organized. And they understood that when the British set up this martial races thing, it was to divide the army against itself. It was to make sure that the army never combined against the British. And they were very impressed with the skill with which the British had designed this army, both to fight and have esprit de corps, but also not to rebel against the British. And also, I would say about these Japanese characters, many of them were ideologically very much against the white empires. They wanted to show that Asia was for the Asians. They were committed to liberating India. And these characters, these Japanese officers, connected with the nationalist Indian officers. And there is a meeting there that had the overall balance of forces in World War II been different, had the Axis powers won, man in the high castle time, then we would have had, I think you would have seen something very different come out of that. A Japanese-Indian alliance is imaginable in that census. But in practice, the way the war worked out, when the Japanese finally are in a position to make a move into India, it's just too late. The Indians are conscious political people who are paying attention to the war. By 44, it's pretty clear who's going to win.
Yeah, and you always try and back the winner. That's the role of Congress and Gandhi is quite interesting, because obviously, had they fomented a revolt with their positions of authority, then perhaps that might have had more power. But I mean, what is their stance when in the First World War, where I've got slightly more comfortable knowledge about this. In the First World War, we know that, for example, the suffragettes, with a few notable exceptions, actually put their campaign on hold for the duration of the war effort. And similarly, home rule in Ireland becomes almost a parked issue for the duration of the war effort. What is the sort of the Congress and Gandhi's response to the war? I mean, are they encouraging people to enlist? Are they still encouraging sort of? So
you're stretching me a little bit. Gandhi is in South Africa in World War I, and
I mean in the Second World War.
Yeah. Oh, in the Second World War is. For everybody in the Indian national movement, they were determined not to allow what happened after World War I to happen again. Right. That's Gandhi was behind the war effort in World War I. He's busy raising money from Indian populations in South Africa to support the war effort in World War I. But when afterwards the British harshly clamped down, that's when the Jallianwala Bagh massacre occurs. The Rowlatt Acts are passed. These are all efforts to reimpose a harsh and endless colonial rule. That's when everyone decides that this isn't what we signed up for. And when World War II comes around, they make a very simple calculation. If this is a war for freedom and democracy, we will be happy to fight on the side of the Western Allies as long as they'll give us freedom and democracy after the war. And the British were not willing to do that. That's the moment at which Congress goes off the war. Now, even though that's the case, and even though they launch an uprising in the middle of the war, they're also aware that, especially by the time we get to 44, that the end of the war is coming, and that the British have been gravely weakened by their war effort, by both war efforts that bankrupted the British Empire. That is the point at which they start encouraging nationalist Indian officers to stay in the army. Don't revolt against the British. We're going to need you. We're going to need an army after we get independence. And so there is also a realization that the Indian Army is a resource for independent India after the British leave. And you'll find lots of mention of this kind of thing in the memoir of Indian officers. They have various conversations with Nehru and other people who are active in Congress who suggest to them. Now, early in the war, in the Quit India time, they did try to get the Indian Army to revolt against the British. They tried very hard. And a lot of the sort of scare that the British authorities have in 1942-43 is they figure out that Congress is trying to access the army, and that Congress people are joining the army in order to agitate from inside and so on. Very little comes of that.
I think we've just got time for one final question, which is from James Marassa, which is about the soldiers of how the soldiers who fought with the British viewed the INA after the war, and how those two sort of conflicting sides were integrated, both, I guess, in the immediate aftermath, but then also in the post-independence.
Yeah. I mean, this is a big topic. Look up Peter Ward Fay's book if you really want to get some information about this. So on the one hand, they're sympathetic. One very prominent officer, K.S. Timia, his brother is in the INA. And so he understands why his brother joined. Timia had also been in Malaya a little bit, but came out before the Japanese took care of it. So there's a kind of sympathy with the situation that they faced in Japanese captivity. And especially if those INA soldiers tried to come back over to the British, or surrendered without killing Indian soldiers, then it was, one had a position of sympathy. But there's also another attitude, right? And especially it becomes stronger as it becomes clear that Congress after the war is going to fet the INA, that Congress got behind the INA. The British made a bad mistake and tried to try INA officers in public. Congress lawyers supported them. Nehru was their lawyer. And this ensured that for the civilian population, the INA looked like heroes. And the actual Indian army that had done the fighting and protected India from Japan were somehow sold as traitors at this time, were not real. And then you get a lot of anger. We served loyally and were, shit in independent India, while these guys who went over to the Japanese are seen as great patriots. And you also get kind of battlefield stuff. How dare you go over to the enemy who has, killed my friend? So I think it's mixed. It's mixed.
I think, sadly, we're going to have to end it there. But I mean, what a wonderful conversation. And Tarak, I wish you could see all these amazing comments we're getting. Catherine, Peter, Adrian, thank you so much for your lovely comments. I'd just love to take this opportunity now to thank you, Tarak, for your amazing insights in this incredibly.
Thank you, everyone who came and joined us. It's really great to talk about this book. I really loved writing it. Once
again, I will urge you to go and buy that book, not only because it helps the museum, but also because it's if you've enjoyed that, just listen to Tarak talk about that for the last 50 minutes or so. Wait till you get really stuck into the meat of that book, because it is excellent. As I say, it's a real game changer, I think, in how we understand this fighting force. There's the donate button is going to be available soon as well to help the museum. Later this afternoon, we're actually going to be talking with Lord David Richards about Commonwealth ex-servicemen. Tarak touched on it a little bit, so come back at 2 o'clock, please, ladies and gentlemen, and join us then. What I'd also just love to do now is just to thank Nicola and Isabel, who are working away in the background of this. You've done such amazing work. If you've enjoyed this VJ Day programming that we've been going through and have more coming up of, honestly, you should see the amount of work those guys have put in. None of this would have happened without them. So Nicola, Isabel, I will lead the digital round of applause for you guys, because it's been absolutely fantastic, and all the success and all the wonderful events we put on are a result of your hard work. So thank you so much for that. I will also say, just before we leave you and go, Tarak talked a little bit about the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, which is a wonderful setup, because live tonight at 7 p.m, there'll be a short film that's been commissioned by the National Army Museum, working with the explorer Leveson Wood and his father, also called Leveson Wood, about Leveson Wood Senior and Leveson Wood Junior's father and grandfather, who served in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers in Burma, an ordinary officer from Stoke, like you say, who ended up in a Welsh battalion. And Nicola's going to show you the trailer of this film now, that we'd love you to be able to see and enjoy, because the museum helped him learn a little bit about it in his time in the war. But on behalf of myself, Professor Barkawi, thank you so much for providing so many wonderful insights and shedding so much light on this brilliant history. It's been a delight to have you on. And thank you very much, Peter, and thank you, Nicola and Isabel. It's great to work with you guys. It's been fantastic, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. We were going to say goodbye now. Hopefully I'll see some of you at 2 o'clock and perhaps in later events in the program. But if not, have a wonderful day, a wonderful weekend, and a great VJ Day tomorrow. So thank you. Goodbye.